the author outside his own person. They proceed from a full-fledged individual created by him, like the lines spoken by a character in a drama he might write. Apart from his writer friends, hardly anyone had noticed the extraordinary diversity of Pessoa's published poetry in Portuguese, most of which had appeared in literary journals with small print runs. And not even his friends, with one or two exceptions, had read his self-published chapbooks of poetry written in English. Pessoa, who was born in Lisbon in 1888, but spent 9 years of his childhood and received most of his schooling in the British-governed town of Durban, South Africa, originally aspired to be an English poet, and his 35 sonnets and Antinous, a poem, both issued in 1918, garnered a favourable review in the Times Literary Supplement. The reviewer warned, however, that most English readers would deplore the subject matter of Antinous, in which the Emperor Hadrian fondly recalls the sensual love of his young male companion, who drowned in the Nile. The warning was unnecessary, since neither of the chapbooks was distributed in the United Kingdom, and they were ignored in Portugal, where the cultural elite read French, not English, as a second language. Pessoa was also an occasional writer of literary criticism and opinion pieces on political and social issues. Quite a few people, at the time of his death, had never read any of his poems, but knew his name very well, since he had caused a stir earlier that year with an audacious front-page article opposing a bill to ban Freemasonry, which Salazar's puppet assembly would unanimously pass into law. And yet Pessoa, just 1 month before publishing his article, had won a government-sponsored prize for his book of nationalist poems. Whose side was he on? Nobody seemed to know for sure. Even among his friends, whom he habitually met in Lisbon's cafes, Pessoa, a resolute bachelor, was a bit of a mystery. He loved talking about literature, philosophy, politics, and religion, but about his personal life he was not forthcoming. Rarely did he invite anyone to his apartment, where he was rumoured to have a large wooden trunk full of hundreds, maybe thousands, of unpublished poems and prose pieces. The trunk indeed existed, and some 10 years after Pessoa's death, more than 300 of the poems it contained found their way into a handsome edition of his poetry, with separate volumes for Alberto Caeiro, Ricardo Reis, Álvaro de Campos, and Fernando Pessoa himself. Since each of the 3 heteronyms boasted a large and exquisite body of work stylistically unlike the poetry of his fellow heteronyms or of Pessoa himself, one could say that Portugal's 4 greatest poets from the 20th century were Fernando Pessoa. But while some people were duly impressed by Pessoa's feat of poetic self-division or self-multiplication, his work was still not widely read, and the superabundant poet was a more mysterious figure than ever. Pessoa's last name happens to be the Portuguese word for person, but there seemed to be no person there, just poems and personae. A vivid picture of Pessoa the man finally materialized in 1950 in Portuguese, with the publication of a 700-page biography by João Gaspar Simões, a critic and former co-editor of the magazine Presença, where Pessoa had published several of his greatest poems, including The Tobacco Shop and Autopsychography. Gaspar Simões' undertaking took readers by surprise, for it was still not clear to most of them that the poet merited such attention. In the book, they learned for the first time about Pessoa's turbulent childhood, marked by the deaths of his father and little brother, his mother's second marriage, and the years he spent in South Africa, about his aborted career as a college student in Lisbon, his failed attempt to start a publishing house, and his freelance work drafting business correspondence in English and French, about his only sweetheart, Ophelia Queiroz, a secretary at one of the offices where he worked, about his interest in the occult, and his meeting with Aleister Crowley, an English magus reviled in his home country as a minister of Satan, and about his literary life and friends. Gaspar Simões also discussed Pessoa's literary